So first off, Dr. Allison Brager, thank you so much for coming here with us and going through this webinar with us at CrossFit Health. It's really awesome to have you on here, especially we go back a really long time
Way
and
back.
early CrossFit days, training in the same city, competing against each other at both regionals back when there were regionals and then the games. So, super awesome to have you on here. And it was really great to have your book as the book of the month for CrossFit Health. Really enjoyed reading it. And I can't wait to go through essentially what is part of chapter 4 throughout this presentation. So really looking forward to it. And before we get started, I'd love to just do an intro for you. So we have Dr. Allison Brager, who's a neurobiologist with focused research in sleep and circadian rhythms for the United States Army. She's used both animal and human models to study resilience to extreme environmental stress. Currently part of the fatigue management and neuroenhancement groups for NATO U.S. Special Operations Command, the Office of the Army Surgeon General, and Intergovernment. And she's the author of our book of the month, which is titled Meathead: Unraveling the Athletic Brain. And we are going to go through a presentation that really digs into sleep and probably a lot of other areas in terms of performance as well. So I'm really looking forward to going through this with you.
Sweet. Well, thank you so much, Mike, Karen, CrossFit Health staff for having me. It's really an honor and it's really a privilege to continue to give back to our community. So a lot of the content from my book came from my own personal experiences as an athlete. I've pretty much been an athlete my entire life, was a 3-sport athlete in high school, did D1 track and field in college. I found the sport of CrossFit when I was in graduate school through a high school friend of mine, Dan Bailey. So he and Julie Fouché and that whole, the OG CrossFit gang, they used to kick my ass every single day. And then I just, continued from there. I had the opportunity to compete against Mike's team, CrossFit Atlanta, head to head in the games. Served on the Army's CrossFit Army Warrior Fitness team for a little bit. So it's just been a great journey and really thankful for all the support CrossFit has given me. Even in situations when I was deployed a few years ago, I was able to do the CrossFit Open. And, I always have felt like a part of the community, no matter where in the world I am. So today I'm going to talk about the one part of CrossFit programming that is often overlooked. And a lot of times people often, I would say, cheat on. A lot of times our community, we're so committed to doing the workouts and adhering to our CrossFit programming that we will often skimp on sleep in order to make the morning workout. And so I hope today to convince you that you should actually not do that, but rather treat sleep just like you treat your training and just like you treat your nutrition and everything else. Next slide. So to begin, the evidence that sleep is a performance enhancing drug is really evident now. So much so that pretty much every single professional sports team has a sleep doc or a team of sleep medicine doctors who they consult with. I've been fortunate enough to be a part of this enterprise. Back in 2020, we actually custom outfitted the locker room of the 2020 national champions that year, the LSU Tigers. And basically what you see here is that every single player had their own napping or sleeping or mindfulness pod where they could just sort of chill and relax leading up to the national championship game. What you see right there is actually the sleep pod of Mr. Joe Burrow. He was a big proponent of sleep being his secret weapon, and he's not he's not just the only athlete. There are tons of elite athletes who are using sleep today as a secret weapon. I also had the opportunity in 2018 to work with the Washington Capitals. That was the year they won the Stanley Cup. I'm not going to say that that's why they won the Stanley Cup, but I do believe that because we came there and provided their players with the best fatigue countermeasures possible, it led to winning the Stanley Cup finals. Next slide. So I do want to focus on one aspect of sleep that is often overlooked. And I present this because, many of us are coaches, not just in CrossFit, but maybe in the community and different sports that our kids play. And this is the role of sleep in mental health. So actually how sleep became really important in the mental health community came about in late 2013. So back in 2013, the NCAA found itself in a really terrible situation. Basically, in 2013, there was the highest number of suicides per year on record across the entire NCAA. And at that time, they really had been ignoring mental health. But because of this, the NCAA could no longer ignore mental health. And in fact, they realized that because collegiate athletes weren't getting enough sleep and were reporting really poor sleep, that sleep needed to be a vital aspect of this mental health initiative. So a team of us, actually, we still sit on the NCAA task force for mental health, came together, sort of wrote this doctrine for the NCAA. And I encourage a lot of you to look at it. Basically, a lot of the principles and practices of good sleep health and how sleep can be used as an athlete to better their athletic performance and to better their mental health is in this manual. And it's free for download on the NCAA's website. Next slide. And then a little bit of the work we've done in the professional sports community are things about the role of sleep and the role of fatigue that you might not even think about. So a few years ago, I actually had this great opportunity to work with the NFL. And we actually found that there is a reason why historically teams who play on the West Coast have better regular season performance than teams from the East Coast. And a lot of it actually has to do with the time the games are played. So if you look at a lot of the teams who are from the West Coast or the Mountain Time Zone, they play games, and I'll talk about this a little bit later why. They play games within their daily peak wake performance zone, whereas teams on the East Coast play games when they're most likely to be fatigued in the afternoon and the late evening because of just natural changes and wakefulness and how sleepy we are across the day. And the reason for this is because of injury. So if you look at the time at which NFL teams are playing certain games, East Coast teams are way more often getting injured during the regular season, particularly when they're playing games in their peak or their low point or fatigue zone. We've shown this with skeletal muscle injury, and we've actually shown it with concussions as well. So again, a really crazy phenomenon related to how sleep relates to human performance. Next slide. So I do want to spend the next few minutes before we get into the question and answer portion about what is sleep, why sleep is important for an athlete, and some of the countermeasures you can do for fatigue, whether you're traveling or you have to wake up really early to train, or say you have to extend your training late into the night after you get off work. So first and foremost, this term actually comes from the Army. We wrote this recent chapter of Army doctrine, and we coined this term that I really love. It's called sleep readiness. And basically what sleep readiness is, this is the hallmark of performance enhancement for an athlete. So if you're practicing good sleep readiness, it means that you are getting at least 7 to 8 hours of sleep per night. And a lot of people will often ask me, well, is there any harm to sleeping in? honestly, there's no harm to sleeping in, because the more sleep, the better. Sleep is kind of like a bank account. The more you put in, the more you can take out. But if you don't have much to start, you're going to have to invest a lot more as time goes on. The next thing is, and this really speaks for people who try to use caffeine, pre-workout, or even exercise to try to stay awake during the day or when they're not getting enough sleep, is only sleep can replace lost sleep. And I'll show evidence for this in a bit when I talk about what happens to testosterone and what happens to growth hormone if you don't get enough sleep. Next slide. So when it comes to the basics of sleep, it's actually not straightforward. When we talk about sleep in our community, we focus on sleep duration, so sleeping 7 to 8 hours per night, but we're also focused on sleep timing in terms of making sure that you are going to bed the same time and you're waking up roughly the same time every day. And these two things, sleep duration and sleep timing, feed into one of these two systems. One of the systems focuses on, in the purple here, you see sleep propensity. Basically, this system is like any other physiological system of the body. The longer you're awake, the greater the drive or pressure there is to sleep. You could sort of see that through the shark fin shape of sleep propensity. The other process, we call it circadian drive for wakefulness. And this is basically the waking signal of the body. This signal is actually determined by your DNA. So you have a certain genetic makeup that actually makes you either a night person by nature, such as someone like me, or a morning person like by nature. This process is pretty much invariable, and so it actually interacts with the sleep propensity system in order to drive what we call these peak performance or go time zones across the day. So for an elite athlete, when we're consulting with collegiate and elite athletes, this is actually the framework we use in order to structure their training or throughout their competition season, to structure their competition season in terms of when they should be eating, when they should be napping, when they should be recovering around this framework. Next slide. Okay, so when it comes to sleep, many of you have probably heard this before, but sleep oscillates in what we call 90-minute cycles throughout the night. So if you're sleeping 8 hours in a night, you should oscillate through about 5 to 6 of these 90-minute cycles. And each 90-minute cycle consists of one of two states of sleep. The first part of the cycle is non-REM, or non-rapid eye movement sleep. The second part of the cycle is REM, or rapid eye movement sleep. And both of these sleep states, non-REM and REM, have very, very distinctive roles in terms of how they benefit performance. In general, we know that non-REM sleep is absolutely essential and absolutely critical for the release of testosterone, growth hormone, insulin growth factor, and the promotion of anabolic processes. I'll show you a little bit later on. If you miss out on non-REM sleep opportunities, you miss out completely on testosterone and growth hormone release. REM sleep, on the other hand, is absolutely critical for learning and memorizing new and retaining old information. We know this from doing lots of sleep deprivation studies over the years, where we will exclusively deprive research subjects of REM sleep. And we find that when we deprive them of REM sleep, they are absolutely incapable of learning new or retaining information. So again, these two processes, they work collectively in order to make up what we call restorative sleep. Next slide. So when it comes to sleep and athletics, this is just focusing on some of the domains that we, when we look at athleticism. And a lot of these domains relate to the 9 tenets of CrossFit. We see a decrease in reaction time, coordination, power, agility, endurance, We see a decrease in the lactic acid threshold. And we also see, and this is something we don't think about as athletes, but it definitely applies to team sport athletes, is teamwork. Next. And as evidence for this, this is actually, so we do a lot of studies in the military where we actively deprive people of sleep for about 40 to 62 hours. The reason we do this is because we're trying to mimic in the lab some of the situations of sleep deprivation that myself or Mike or anyone that serves in the military have experienced in the past. And what we find is sleep deprivation affects the entire system. It doesn't just affect athletic performance, it also affects your emotional health. This is one of the cooler studies I worked on because I think it really applies to the dynamics of the team sport athlete and what happens when communication breaks down when you're fatigued. So basically what we did in this study was we put people through a cycle of sleep deprivation where they were awake for 40 hours. And during that time, they were either presented with faces that were happy, neutral, or threatening. And we found that throughout the course of sleep deprivation, people automatically assumed that neutral faces were threatening and had a full-blown, like, sympathetic nervous system response to actually threatening faces. But what we did find is that if people were loading up on sleep in anticipation of this sleep deprivation, meaning they were just banking on sleep, so they spent the week before the study sleeping in, getting extra sleep, they were protected from experiencing negative and threatening stimuli. So they were less likely to perceive anything in their environment as threatening. So you can imagine how this can translate to a soldier and how this can translate to an athlete. If you're prioritizing sleep before the competition or before the competition season, you're going to be set up for success across the board. Next slide. Okay, so this relates to the role of sleep deprivation in anabolic performance. This is not my own data. This is actually historical data that has been collected over the last 20 to 30 years. And every time this data is collected in young males, older males, and even now in females, we find the same exact results. And it really speaks to the negative consequences of depriving yourself of sleep on next day performance. So basically what this is sort of summarizing is with this research, when people are sleeping 8 hours a night, normal healthy amounts, your levels of testosterone, your levels of growth hormone, your levels of insulin growth factor are absolutely optimal. But as soon as you drop your sleep by about 60%, where you're only getting 5 to 6 hours a night, your testosterone levels cut in half. It only takes 3 days, so less than 72 hours, for your testosterone levels to acutely drop because of lack of sleep. And the only way that these testosterone levels recover is through getting adequate sleep after. So again, this is something to consider the next time that you want to skimp out on sleep in order to get in a really early strength training session, because that's what your programming requires. I would encourage you to sleep in instead and maybe restructure your day to make sure that you're getting enough sleep for recovery. Next slide. So the next thing I really want to focus on, and this sort of speaks to my last slide, is when it comes to planning sleep, it's not always perfect. Not all of us are elite athletes. And we have to structure our sleep around our family commitments. We have to structure it around when the gym is open for business. We also probably aren't going to sleep the night before a competition. I don't care who you are, if you're an amateur or you're an elite CrossFitter. No one who cares about how they perform sleeps the night before the competition. So you can never, ever rely on the night of sleep before a competition to get good sleep. You should not be getting good sleep. You should be banking up on sleep prior to. And then lastly, there are some strategies for eliminating jet lag. But for the most part, if you're traveling, across the Atlantic or across the United States, it's inevitable you're going to be jet lagged. And I like to just tell people that information up front. So you're better investing in fatigue countermeasures such as strategic caffeine dosing, as you know, as a result, because of that. Next slide. So this sort of just re-summarizes a lot of what I said in the last slide. Ideally, when it comes to sleep, you want to carve out time where you can sleep for 7 to 8 hours. Obviously, this isn't the case for everyone. A less optimal strategy is to sleep in, you know, a 5-6 hour block at night, and then carve out an hour in your day if you can for a nap. Like I said, it's less ideal, but really what you don't want to do is just limit your total sleep in a 24-hour period to 5 or 6 hours, because from that, you're going to see performance decrements. You're not going to see performance gains. Next slide. Next. And next. Okay. So when it comes to fatigue countermeasures, what you see here on the left is sort of the rubric in terms of how many hours of sleep equate to how many hours of recovery. This relationship can be extended to performance too. This data actually comes from a long-standing research program in the military where we have actively studied sleep through wearables and have looked at next day combat performance. And we find that soldiers who were able to get 7 or 8 hours of sleep during training or even in austere situations are almost 80 to 100% combat effective, versus those who are only getting 5 hours. They're only about 25% combat effective. And it's the same with recovery too. If you historically look through the literature in terms of the relationship of daily sleep health in athletes as well. Other things that I want to point to your attention that we can also talk about in the Q&A are fatigue management strategies. This is a big focus of what I do for the Department of Defense. It's also a big focus in terms of consulting within collegiate and elite athletic communities. First off, napping is a wonderful thing. I know there's a lot of stigma around napping, especially in an organization like I work for in the military, but we've actually been able to change the culture in the military, and a lot of soldiers and commanders now provide time for what we call TNT, or tactical napping time. Ideally, you should be napping for about 20 to 30 minutes at a time. You shouldn't really nap more than 30 minutes because it can have the potential to interfere with your sleep that night. Another cool thing, this is actually a free app that was developed by the Department of Defense. It just launched 4 months ago, and it's from literally 15 years of research on strategic caffeine dosing with elite military units. The app is called Peak Alert, and basically what it does is it makes you take a test of reaction time. It's like a 2-minute test, and then from that it will give you a caffeine dosing schedule. So if you have really good reaction time, you know, you might only need like 1 or 2 cups of coffee throughout the day in order to sustain your performance. But if you're sleep deprived, it will actually give you the amount and the time at which you should take caffeine. And in addition to, you know, providing recommendations for using coffee as a source of caffeine, there's actually this really cool product that the military developed years ago, and it's by far one of the best things for pre-workout or something to just chew while you're competing. It's military energy gum. It's basically like a chiclet, and it delivers 100 milligrams of caffeine in a matter of 5 minutes directly to your brain, because it travels through one cavity instead of being, you know, digested by your stomach and everything. So it's a rapid, really awesome performance enhancing source of caffeine that of course is legal. But yeah, you take 1 to 2 pieces of that and you are good to go. Next slide. Okay, so the last thing I want to focus on before we get into the Q&A is pre-sleep routine. This is something that seems so simple, but it's actually the most important thing. This is actually the framework for the most effective form of treatment for insomnia, known as cognitive behavioral therapy for insomnia. A lot of times, This is what sleep physicians are dissecting the pre-sleep routine when people come to them with sleep complaints. So honestly, your sleep routine should start about 90 minutes before bed. I do this religiously. I do it not just when I'm home, but I travel all the time for work, and I make sure I exercise the sleep routine every time I travel because it really keeps me healthy at the end of the day. But at 90 to 60 minutes before you go to bed, you put away your work, you put away your phones, and you just start preparing your brain for sleep. Just like you prepare your body for a CrossFit workout by warming up, you have to prepare your brain for sleep. And then about 30 minutes before you go to bed, you actually want to start dimming the lights. This is a great hack. The reason for it is because being in the presence of dim light actually stimulates the production and release of melatonin from your pineal gland. And this can really help you fall asleep, and it can help you stay asleep. And then lastly, when you are sleeping, these are some great hacks. They were actually developed by NASA years ago in terms of what makes up an optimal sleeping environment. First and foremost, you want to make sure the temperature of the room is between 66 and 72 degrees. A lot of people, if they don't want to get their house that cool, will use something such as the chili pad or one of those cooling pads under their mattresses. I personally also recommend sleeping naked. I've slept naked for like the last 15 years, and it's another great way to stay cool as well. In terms of light, you want absolutely no light. You don't want even that small bit of blue light or green light that's being emitted from your electronics. You might think this is ridiculous, but it's absolutely true. That little amount of light has the ability to screw and stop the release of melatonin, even if it's so subtle. When it comes to noise, you want to sleep in a really quiet room, or you want to use like a white noise machine. There's a lot of research around white noise, and actually this new thing called pink noise. It's actually clinically effective to help improve your sleep. And then when it comes to humidity, you want to, similar to temperature, you want to keep it within modest levels. You don't want to be sleeping in a hot and humid room. But I'm telling you, if you practice these things, you will have better quality sleep at night. Next slide. And like I said, sleep, it is absolutely important for athletic performance. It's even more important when you travel. So for those of you who are competing in Madison next week, it should be part of your game plan, just like with everything else leading into the CrossFit Games. Next slide. And then lastly, I know we're going to have a Q&A here, but if you do have any other questions that aren't addressed, you can hit me up on Instagram or email. And then, yes, my book is available for sale through Barnes & Noble, through Amazon. I'm happy if you ever see me around, North Carolina or my many travels, sign a copy for you. But a lot of what I talk about tonight is in chapter 4 of this book. This book in general, for those of you who haven't read it yet, it more or less focuses on the neuroscience of exercise, why exercise is absolutely important for your brain health, sort of what separates an elite athlete from an amateur athlete in terms of the connections and how efficient the brain works. And then lastly, a focus on sleep, recovery, and performance. And so with that, that's all I have. And I think Mike's going to ask me a few questions, and then we'll get to the Q&A.
Yes, awesome. Thank you so much. And also, I've been reading your book, and I love it. It's amazing. I wish, as I'm going through a lot of this in your book, I really wish I had that information back when I was competing heavily, as well as some of the sleep information you just went over today. So, I do have a few questions. One, early on in this presentation, you talked about the NFL teams, East versus West, and you had said the West Coast teams, one of the benefits of being in the West Coast teams is they were able to play, I think you called it like daily peak performance zones, right?
Mm-hmm.
One, like when is that zone within the day for, I guess essentially like when is that zone, number one. And then number two, how does that apply to like CrossFit training? Is that something that, if possible, if people have a little bit more flexibility in their day, can they apply that to CrossFit training? Can they structure their day so they go into the gym and they work out in this peak performance zone throughout their day?
So great question. And yes, I'll answer the second part first, because
Okay.
honestly, this is why I think I was successful in the early years and did so well so quickly and competed in the CrossFit Games, is because I was able to train in my peak performance zone when I was a fellow in Atlanta. So basically, there's two peak performance zones, and it's because you saw that rhythm. It's bimodal, so it oscillates twice every 24 hours. The first peak performance zone, and this is what I utilized when I was a fellow working in the hospital, was it's between 10 a.m. and 1 p.m. So if you look at a lot of the West Coast teams, when they're playing on the East Coast, they're playing on 10 a.m., 11 a.m. their time. So they are in their peak. Whereas the East Coast teams, they're starting to creep into that danger zone, because between 2 and 4 p.m. every day, that's when you see this dip. And that's a big fatigue zone. The second peak performance zone is actually right before or a little bit after dinner. So you know how a lot of times after we eat, we're so sleepy, and then all of a sudden, like an hour later, we get a second wind. That's the other peak performance zone. So between like 7 and 9 at night. So again, if you're talking about an elite CrossFit athlete, this is when they should be training. I sort of was training during that time when I was competing, not realizing that was the reason why, but it worked out, and that's what I would do if I was trying to make it to the next level in CrossFit, or just optimize my performance in general, right? Like reduce injury, increase output, all of that.
Yeah, and the fact that there are two zones, it makes it a little bit easier, I think, for people to structure their day around it and try to get the most out of their training and do so by mitigating some injury risk, right? That's really cool. One of the other ones was on all right, so you had said if you're getting 5 to 6 hours of sleep, it only takes 3 days for your testosterone to get cut in half, right? So let's say, unfortunately, this takes place. Maybe it's stress, maybe it's some kind of work environment or something that prevents you from sleeping more than 5 to 6 hours for 3 days straight. How long does it take for it to get back up to 100% if you go back to a 7 to 8 hour sleeping schedule?
So in general, it's a 2-to-1 ratio. So for every day of sleep deprivation, it takes you about 2 days to get back on track.
Wow.
If you're sleeping 8 hours. And you say, wow, but honestly, this is why people who do night shift work or like night operations, why it truly takes them years to get their sleep back to normal, because it requires twice the amount, which makes sense, right? It's a bank account. So if you're paying 3 hours here, but yet the next day you still need that 8 hours, now you're going to have to sleep 11 hours to make up for that. So,
wow. You talked about banking on sleep. That's one thing I wish I knew a little bit more prior to competing, because I just couldn't sleep. I mean, I'd stay awake for 48 hours for the first 2 days of regionals or the games.
Yeah.
And had I known that I could at least, combat that a little bit by banking up on sleep prior to competition, I would have utilized that as part of my program, but I did not.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of people don't, and I mean that's true. At the games, like you never sleep. I competed in it twice, but I never ever had anything in regionals or the games where I felt rested and restored all weekend. It's just you don't sleep.
No, it's crazy. Okay, so you talked about some of the hormonal, I guess I'm going to say risks of sleep deprivation. But the other side of it, the the REM side is, learning, memory, and retention. So if I am getting chronic sleep deprivation and then maybe trying to fight that with, let's not say coffee or, single ingredient caffeine supplementation. What if I'm trying to fight that with energy drinks that are high in all different types of caffeinated ingredients and sugar?
And kill your brain cells.
Okay, that's my thing. So
they create neurotoxicity.
Yeah, interesting. There are multiple issues here in terms of sleep deprivation, and then trying to fight that off with supplementation that, high energy, high sugar, high caffeine energy drinks. You lower hormonal levels, and then brain shrinkage. Is that what you had said? Or what did you say? Neurotoxicity?
Yeah, so it's basically the neurons get so overstimulated that they die. Like that's
Wow.
They haven't shown this in humans because that'd be unethical, but they've done rodent and mouse studies to show this, and that's what happens. Not all energy drinks, it's just like the classic ones that are like super high in caffeine, but then also have this other crap in it that it's just chemical overload for the brain.
Okay. Wow. Yeah, that's nuts. That's crazy. Kind of along, I don't know, along those lines to some extent, what is, when we're trying to measure things like sleep zones, whether it's non-REM or REM, how accurate are some of these trackers like watches or bands or rings in actually determining these zones and how long you've been in these zones or your sleep quality?
So the trackers today are actually pretty good. Okay. Nothing will be as close to the gold standard of doing an actual sleep study, but they each have their merits, and give you a really honest assessment of restorative sleep. Because I think the biggest thing with these trackers is to look for stability over time. So as soon as you start trending down, like that's an issue. If you're trending up, that's awesome. And you have to consciously then think about things you did in your day that led to that. One of the best quotes I've heard recently about wearables is from Clive Brewer. He is like the world's leading expert in mental health. He's worked with special forces. He's worked with Manchester United, Toronto Blue Jays. He said that data from wearables should just make you curious. And that's really true. They're not meant to diagnose, treat any sort of medical or health condition. They're supposed to provide conscious awareness in terms of how your lifestyle choices affect your sleep and recovery that night.
Yeah, I think they do a good job with that. So any error that is built into these wearables is somewhat consistent. So if you're looking at trends, you at least get some feedback on what's working and what isn't. I assume, is that correct?
Yes, absolutely. Yeah. And that's what, we use a lot of wearables in the military side, and that's exactly what we're looking at are trends. And if a soldier starts trending down for 3 or 4 days, then, we have the chaplain go talk to them, or, somebody in their formation go talk to them.
That's cool that they're actually prioritizing that now in terms of not only performance, but mental health as well. That's awesome. All right, let's start taking some. We already have quite a few questions that have already been asked. So essentially we have 16 minutes. We will start busting through these as quickly as we can. We'll start, I think Kendall Gray starts the actual questions based off of the presentation. So this is
great. Okay. CBD. Yep. Okay. So benefits of CBD. So there's not a lot of research out there. I will say a few years ago in the military, we tried to do a CBD related study, and then it sort of went away because of stigma and all that. But I will say neurochemically, CBD acts on this system. It's called the endocannabinoid system. And that system, when activated properly, we think can improve sleep quality and overall sleep health, particularly in people who have insomnia. We are trying to use it for people who suffered from PTSD related nightmares and had insomnia as a result. But I do, see a lot of value in CBD, just thinking of it from a pure neurochemical, neurobiological perspective. And that's all I can say on it.
Perfect. Okay, so then next is Mandy Peterson.
Thoughts on fluoride calcifying the pineal gland and affecting sleep negatively? Well, I haven't heard of this particular like biological process, but I will say, so the pineal gland I mentioned is what produces and releases melatonin. So if there is disruption to the pineal gland, whether it's from environmental or biological influence, it's going to impact sleep because it's going to interfere with the release of melatonin.
Okay, so it's possible, I guess, but nothing that you could answer. Okay, let's see what else we have here. Yes, I think it looks like we might have been in presenter. We were not able to do one slide at a time. Well, we'll fix that.
Okay, what strategies do you recommend for individuals with a variable work schedule who work nights and 24-hour shifts? Excellent question. So that slide I showed previously with like the optimal sleeping schedule, and then the lesser optimal. A lot of times people who engage in shift work have to adopt the lesser optimal schedule, but it's still better than getting 5 or 6 hours of sleep. It's basically, you have that nighttime block where you try to get, your 5 or 6, and then you carve out an hour of the day for a nap. And if you can't nap for an hour, try little chunks here and there. I will say that these guided meditation protocols, it's called iRest or Yoga Nidra. Those are also very effective. So even if you're not getting like a full blown 20 minutes sleep through a nap, just sort of downscaling your brain is enough to lend some recovery benefits that can sort of put, add more sleep credits to the sleep bank account.
Perfect.
Okay, so next one, sleep debt, is it real? Yes, it's real. Okay, another question about CBD. Okay, this is a great one from Reagan. What are your thoughts around insomnia medications for those who suffer? So medications are always the last resort. I will say that's actually one thing the military has been doing really well recently is instead of just writing prescriptions for Ambien and Lunesta, which honestly are the devil's drugs and don't treat the problem, but actually can they're just putting a Band-Aid around the problem. Some non-pharmacological treatments, such as cognitive behavioral therapy for insomnia, or CBTI for short, seems to be one of the most effective forms of treatment for insomnia. So I would go down that road before you going down to drugs.
Okay.
What time might be ideal to train? We already looked at that.
We went through that one, yeah.
How do you uncover in a general way your natural circadian rhythm? Great question. Honestly, it's just through feel. And I know that seems like a really broad esoteric answer, but you just have to figure out and pay attention to when you perform at your peak and when you don't. I realized early on in early adulthood that I was a complete night owl. I do my best creative work at night. I also do it in around noon and 1, which is a little bit later of the peak optimal zone. You have to just pay attention to your body and your mind and figure it out as is. I mean, you could also do a genetic screen too, that those tests from 23andMe and a few of the other commercial genetic companies, you can find out that way too. It basically confirmed I was a night owl, just like my mother and my father and a lot of other people in my family.
Interesting.
You dress minor while sleeping. Do you recommend a sleep mask? So if you're sleeping in a dark room, you don't need a mask. If you aren't sleeping in an optimal sleeping environment, yes, wear a mask. I've done a lot of work with soldiers in austere environments, and as Mike knows from being deployed, it's not that It's not optimal at all for sleeping. And we actually arm a lot of our higher tier units now with little sleep kits where they have a sleep mask and they have earplugs to block out the noise and to block out the light. So yeah, I'd wear a mask if you need it.
What about, let me ask you a question really quick. So what about like red light? You know, that it's become a big thing in terms of like biohacking and that kind of stuff. So people using that at night or closer to bedtime, does that affect sleep positively, negatively? Like, how does that affect sleep?
I'm happy you asked that because that is one thing I failed to mention. Red light has zero biological effect on your body. You could stare at a red light for an hour and it will do nothing to you biologically. So when we talk about the spectrum of light and the spectrum that impacts sleep directly, we're talking about white and blue light. Okay. Obviously, that's the basis for blue light blocking glasses. But red light, I mean, really what they're doing is, okay, they're looking at red light, but they're downscaling, right? Because they're not doing anything exciting on the phone. They're not watching TV. They're sort of just in this state of mindfulness. And yes, they're staring at a red light, but really their brain activity is just downscaling.
So essentially it's just a way to trick you into mindfulness to some extent?
Pretty much.
Interesting. Okay.
Would deep sleep be considered REM? So deep sleep is considered not stage 3 non-REM, but REM is part of what we call restorative sleep. So restorative sleep is stage 3 non-REM and REM sleep. Okay. I don't want to get into specifics, but that's the specifics for those of you who wanted to know. And it's also in my book. Any suggestions for an app on white or pink noise? And what's the difference? Okay, so we actually talked about this earlier with Karen before we started. White noise is something like a fan, like radio static, things like that. Pink noise, this has actually been used in some clinical sleep research trials. Pink noise, it's a little bit softer. So if you want to think about like sounds of nature, that could be considered pink noise. In terms of apps, I don't really have a preference. I do know, like when I travel in a hotel room, there's this one app that's called Pink Noise, and there's a person of a yogi meditating. I use that one, but I don't know if there's any, preferred app. Obviously, in our clinical research study, we used, research grade stuff, so we didn't use an app. Strategy for staying asleep or falling back to sleep. This is a great one. I talked about earlier using strategies such as yoga nidra or guided meditation and like guided breath. That's been clinically shown to help people fall asleep and then fall back to sleep, especially in people who are prone to insomnia. One thing people might not realize is there's many forms of insomnia. There's an insomnia where you can't fall asleep. There's middle of the night insomnia where you wake back up and you can't fall back to sleep. And then there's one people don't think about, but it's actually very common, is premature awakening insomnia. So basically you wake up at 5, 6 a.m. You only got 4 or 5 hours of sleep, but you need more sleep than that and you can't fall back to sleep. So insomnia it's not a one size fits all. It does come in many forms, but guided meditation, yoga nidra, all that stuff has been shown to help. What is the utility of using blue light blocking glasses? So I sort of answered that. They are great for blocking out the blue light and sort of preserving melatonin release. One thing, though, I will say is that people try to use blue light blocking glasses as a workaround or an excuse to do something exciting, like talk to people on your phone, be on TikTok, watch TV. So it's sort of self-defeating because you're stimulating your brain doing these things. Like it actively catalyzes this brain state called alpha activity and beta activity that makes it super excited. So you're defeating the purpose wearing blue light blocking glasses. Do you recommend sleep? This is a great one. And I was going to present this slide, but I chose not to, so I could talk about it now. Do you recommend sleep studies for athletes, military members? Absolutely. So I've done a lot of research over the years, and so have my colleagues, where we've done longitudinal sleep assessments across the entire active duty military population. We've worked with Division I sports teams. In our military, about 80% of soldiers, no matter how old you are, have sleep apnea. I have sleep apnea. I also have restless leg syndrome. I'm part of the 80% statistic. If you look at D1 football players, we found in a study that a single team, about 70% of an entire D1 football team has sleep apnea. The reason for that is, so the trade-off of being an athlete is you have a lot of muscle around your neck, a lot of muscle around your chest. Muscle weighs more. So when you sleep at night and your muscles relax, it's more laborious to breathe. And if you aren't sleeping on your side, if you're sleeping on your back or in your stomach, you're going to make breathing even more difficult. And so you're going to be more prone to sleep apnea. It's a trade-off of being an athlete, but 70% of athletes have it. I guarantee if we did like a whole assessment of elite CrossFit athletes, you would find sleep apnea in about 70% of them.
Interesting.
Let's see. Out of curiosity, how do you peak performance zone? How do peak performance zones relate to cortisol diurnal rhythms? Excellent question, all related. So that's one of the things that sort of determines your peak performance zone is cortisol release. Cortisol is a wake promoting hormone. So you want to plan your times of when cortisol is rising around when you're performing. There's actually this great study showing this from the weightlifting community. So there's this study that found that people who lift in the evening have to take caffeine in order to match the performance of people who are weightlifting mid-morning. So our cortisol levels start rising and they start peaking mid-morning. And so if you're lifting, then you're going to be at peak performance because you're releasing all those energy resources that are used and required to lift heavy. But if you're lifting in the evening and your body's starting to downscale and prepare itself for sleep, you need something like caffeine to match mid-morning performance.
So would you recommend, since there are those two peaks and essentially two peak performance zones, structuring training to where things that are more heavier and more explosive would happen in that first peak, and then something a little bit less intense would happen in the second peak if you were trying to structure, let's say, 2 workouts a day?
Yep.
Is that
yeah, so it's kind of the reverse of what most people do, right? Like a lot of people do their zone training in the morning and then their metabolic conditioning in the evening. I would actually, so when I was on the CrossFit team at the Army, like we did the same thing. Like we all recognize that if you do the metabolic conditioning first and just save the zone 2 stuff for later on, like you're going to do better and you're going to recover better.
Interesting. Yeah, I would say that a lot of people do it in the reverse.
Mm-hmm. Does one's chronotype not alter the timing of peak performance zone? So chronotype does determine peak performance zone. I would say most people, I think it's like 80% of the population are intermediates, meaning that like your peak performance zone is going to be from 10 a.m. to 1 p.m. People who are morning people, their peak performance zone is going to be usually before 10 a.m. And then people who are vampires like me, like their peak performance zone is going to be closer to noon. So again, the only way to know is, by feel, or if you're like me and get a genetic test, you'll find out if you're a morning person, which is like 10% of the population truly, or an evening person or intermediate. Okay, we have about a minute left. How many more questions do you want us to go?
Let's do 2 more, and then here's the thing. We'll do 2 more, and I'd love to continue this at some point. We can find more ways to do more webinars and answer these questions, and we can keep working together. But and then they also have your contact information too, so they can follow you and maybe ask a question here or there. But I mean, we'll do two more, but I got to tell you, this has
Okay.
been awesome, and I want to keep this going and continue to have you on with CrossFit Health, because this has been great. Thank you so much.
Oh, of
Listening to
course.
you.
So
Yeah.
funny enough, the next question is from my former CrossFit Games teammate, the one and only Joey Canezzi. He's actually, the guy on the title slide that looks like he's sleeping on the 6-foot wall. That's Joey. So hi, Joey. What are the limits of sleep is a debit card analogy? Can I sleep 100 hours in 1 week and not sleep at all the next week? So this is a great question, because I have been asked this before by several soldiers. While there is a sleep bank account, like there's right and left limits for everything. So ideally, when we were doing these sleep banking, sleep extension studies, most people would only see a benefit up to sleeping about 1.5 to 2 hours more than they typically do. When these individuals extended sleep beyond that, there actually was a decrease in performance. It's classic, like physiological homeostasis. If you push too much, you're going to have a negative effect. If you push too little, you're going to have a negative effect. So there's a sweet spot. But that's a great question, because I've been asked it before.
Yeah.
And then the last one is somebody else I also know right after Joey, Peter Merlin. I'm laying in bed. I know I'm not sleeping, and I am not sleeping, but I am resting. How does that fit into my total sleep time? So great question. Because this is one of the things when it comes to wearables that I try to convey people of is don't focus on total time in bed, focus on total time asleep. Like, it's great that you're resting and sort of downscaling your body into a state of sleep, but it's not actually sleep, so it doesn't count as part of the sleep account, if that makes sense.
Perfect. Geez, there's so many more. I wish we could get to them all. But I mean, you know what? That just means
Everyone sleeps.
yeah, and everybody wants to know how to sleep better and more, and how it affects performance and how they can perform better. I mean, they're all CrossFitters, right? So that's what it's all about. It just lets me know, like, we need to just keep doing this and find more ways to get information out with you. So this has been amazing. Once again, everybody, there's a lot of that information here in the Meathead book, so check that out. Allison, is there anything that's coming out in the future, anything you're working on, anything you're super excited about that people can look out for?
So a lot of the data I presented is part of what will be soon be the first textbook on sleep medicine for athletes. I and some of my colleagues who are also CrossFitters in the sleep medicine community wrote the chapter on circadian advantages for elite athletes. I'm sure you saw that reference throughout my slide. So I'm super excited about that, because it will be the first textbook, and we really hope that that textbook ends up in every single athletic trainers, coaches, strength and conditioning coaches, and people, professional sports communities across the board. But yeah, other than that, just excited to continue to be part of the community and see each other throughout the year. And Mike and I might be old souls now, but we still have that competition heart. Get down inside and get after it when we can.
Yeah, it's different. We're just trying to get into some of those like big masters competitions now.
Exactly.
But it's still there for sure. Really cool. And that textbook is when do you expect it to be released? Is there
well, it's behind schedule. I think it's supposed to be like another 6 months or so.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right.
We don't get any kickbacks from it, but it's just cool, like in our research community, you're just cool to be a part of things, not make money from them.
Awesome. And so everybody, this will be released, the recording, and it'll also have Allison's social media and then your email as well, right, on the slide. So if they have any additional questions, maybe they can reach out and follow you and get more information as well. So thank you so much.
Yeah,
and we'll have to do it again. Thank you.
We will. Yeah, we'll have to do quarterfinals again next year.
I know. It would be great to go back to Power Monkey Camp and do it there. That was awesome. So
yes, it was.
Really cool. All right. Thank you. Thank you, everyone.